Hi, good morning. I'm Gabe, and this is Bible Bites. Today we're talking about John chapter 7. Now, if you've been following along the series, you know that for the majority of the book of John, in each chapter, the chapters break down into two stories, basically, well, sort of a before and after, sometimes a physical representation and a spiritual representation. In the last chapter, John chapter 6, we see three individual stories. And now, as we move into John chapter 7, we sort of hold on to that a little bit, but it's a little bit different. It's not three separate stories. It's really talking about one event, the Feast of Tabernacles. And if you want to kind of get an idea of what is the through line or the major theme of John chapter 7, it's all about the word timing. Jesus is working through a timeline that is outside of what anybody understands on earth, and he's working on God's timeline, which is an important lesson for us. So here we see the Feast of Tabernacles. We find out what Jesus is doing before the feast, what's happening during the feast, and what happens after the feast. Three individual. It's really one event, but broken down into three sections. And timing is the overarching theme to take out of it. I think for me, I want you to read it. Tell me what you think as well. So the first part is what happens before the Feast of Tabernacles. Jesus is in Galilee with his disciples, and they say, "Well, the feast is coming up. If you're going to be the leader, if you're going to be the Messiah, you need to be seen by people. The feast is the place to do it. So come on, we're going to the feast, and the feast is in Judea." And Jesus says, "Nope." Part of it is the Jews and the Pharisee leadership are trying to kill me, so this isn't a good time to do that. Pardon me. So what we want to do is you go on ahead to the feast. I'll stay back, and I will go when the timing is right. I'm going on to God's timeline, not your timeline. I get what you're trying to do, disciples. You're trying to get me exposure, trying to do some marketing for me, trying to get me in front of the crowds. I get it. This isn't the right time. So here we have an example of what it means to um, want to do something that seems right in man's perception of how to do things, but it really comes across as we're going to do what God wants to do and follow his timeline because it's just not time yet. But there's a twist. So that's the first part of the story. The second part of the story is during the feast. So what happens is that the disciples go on ahead, they follow what Jesus says. They go to the Feast of Tabernacles, and the feast lasts, it's not one day, it lasts quite a while. Jesus does go to the feast, but he goes separately and he goes secretly. And he's watching from the shadows, he's checking out the action, he's seeing all the things that are going on. And then when the time is right, he heads to the temple and he starts preaching up a storm. So even though he told his disciples, "I'm not ready to be seen just yet," going in with his disciples at the beginning of the feast, he actually goes there secretly and starts preaching in the middle of the feast, loudly from the temple for all to see, and he's getting the crowd stirred up. They're like, "Well, who is this guy?" And he's saying all these things that the Messiah would say, but is he the Messiah? It says that, and one of the things that they point to is the prophecies from the Old Testament, where they say, "Well, you won't know where the Messiah comes from," which is true, spiritually speaking. And man doesn't know what heaven is like. Only God knows, and everyone who's already in heaven knows what that's like. But they already knew that Jesus was from Nazareth and born in Bethlehem and all these things. So they knew where he's from. So they said, "Hey, he can't be the Messiah because we know where he's from." But the Bible says from in the Old Testament, especially from the time of Moses, that we won't know where he's from. And so now there's confusion because now there's bickering and arguing over the prophecies of the Old Testament. And Jesus says, "Why are you getting hung up on what the Old Testament says when you don't even believe it? Because Moses gave you the laws, he gave you the 10 Commandments, he gave you all the examples of how to live and lead, and you're not even following that. So why are you getting hung up with me and your false interpretation of understanding where I'm supposed to come from when you're not even following simple basic laws like the 10 Commandments?" So don't be a hypocrite. Don't get hung up on yourself. I am who I am. I am the Son of God. I am the Messiah. I am the Christ. And this is why. And he's preaching up a storm. So now he's got the crowd stirred up. And now he's causing the crowd to kind of question their understanding of the Old Testament, which happens to be off, a little false, you could say, because they're in some cases taking a interpretive understanding of the Old Testament. In some cases, they're taking a literal understanding of the Old Testament. So that's starting to cause separation among the crowd between people who will believe Jesus based on his word, but also people who are more believing of the Old Testament laws as laid down through tradition rather than what God is actually saying to them. And then we break it up into the third part. which is what sort of happens as a result, an aftermath of that, if you want. Pardon me. And the Pharisees say, well, there's Jesus. There's the guy we've been trying to kill. Guards, go get him and go arrest him. And so the guards go and they are heading into this crowd, which is getting stirred up. Not quite a mob, but definitely getting agitated. And they're listening to what Jesus is saying. He's like, and the guards are saying, I've never heard anybody preach like this. I've never heard anybody say things like this. And I'm really questioning, is this really the Christ? Is this the Messiah? Is this the person we're trying to arrest? I don't think we're supposed to be doing that. And plus, you have a crowd that's getting really stirred up and could turn into a mob if they just decide to jump in and arrest a guy. They'd be greatly outnumbered, which could create a dangerous situation for those guards. So they give it up and they say, well, we're not going to arrest this guy because I don't want to get in the middle of that and I don't understand what's going on. And they head back to the Pharisees. And the Pharisees say, well, why didn't you arrest him? He was right there. He said, well, first of all, he's preaching a bunch of stuff that we've never heard before, and he might be the Christ, and we're not going to put hands on the Christ because that would be foolish. Also, you got a big crowd that's getting stirred up, and if we just jumped in there and try to arrest him, they might attack us, and we can't deal with that. So now here we have the Pharisees trying to arrest Jesus because he's claiming to be the Christ, and he's essentially threatening their domain of power, and nobody wants to go in and do the dirty work because Jesus is using the power of the Spirit, using the power of the Word to create energy, to create momentum, to get people on his side. And now they don't know how to handle that. This is not just some schlub uh, spewing off Bible verses on a corner with a sign and looking like a crazy person. This is somebody who's actually preaching with the power of God in his voice, and they don't know how to handle it. And so now that's creating tension and division, even among the Pharisees' guards and their own group of leadership as well. So that's the book of John, chapter 7. What do I get out of that? I get out of that timing. The first part, Jesus says, I'm not going to the feast with you right now because it's not the right time. Then Jesus secretly goes to the Feast of Tabernacles, and then he starts preaching about halfway through because then it was the right time, even though that seems off for what man would understand would be the right time to do things. And then when we get to the last part with the guards, they are sent to go arrest Jesus, and then they don't do it because like this is not the right time because A, we don't understand what he's preaching, and it's kind of maybe freaking us out a little bit. And B, if we arrest him in the middle of this mob and this crowd that's getting agitated and stirred up, they could turn on us, and it's not the right time for us to arrest him. Plus, this is all working into God's plan because Jesus proclaims in the middle of his debates with some of the people in the crowd that my time is short. So he knows that he's going to eventually be arrested. He knows eventually that he has to die to bring salvation into the world, but it's not now, and the timing is not right. So this entire chapter is all about timing, following God's timing, and even though the timing might seem off in the moment, it all eventually is working towards whatever God has in store for, at that time, Jesus and the disciples, but also for you and for me. So things happen. The lesson I can guess what we can get out of that is that things happen in a way that they're meant to happen, even though the timing doesn't even make sense or we don't quite understand it. You just have to go with it. If God is leading you and you're sure God is leading you, even if the timing doesn't make any sense, go with it. He's got it under control, and eventually it's going to work out to something great. Sorry, frog in my throat, but thank you for sticking with me. So read John chapter 7, leave a comment below and let me know what you got out of it. I'm telling you what I got out of it. I want to know what you got out of it. So thank you for joining. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and have a great day. God bless, and I will talk to you soon.